I didn't learn about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child until around 2007 while I was living in Cambodia, where that particular treaty was an important framework for helping us address family violence, human trafficking, and community development. Maybe it shouldn't be too surprising that it took so long for me to learn about that convention since it's still relatively young. It was adopted on this day, November 20th, in 1989 by the UN General Assembly and became effective in September the next year after it was ratified by the required number of member states. It's a very basic commitment, and I do encourage you to read it. It's easy to find on the internet. It's a basic commitment to honoring and protecting the dignity and humanity of children. And 196 nations, including every member of the United Nations except one, has made that commitment. The one UN member that is still holding out 3 decades later is, you guessed it, the United States of America. To our credit, the United States has ratified 2 optional protocols on restricting children in armed conflict and the sale of children. But as President Barack Obama described it during his 2008 presidential campaign, our collective failure to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child is embarrassing. Nevertheless, even embarrassment has been insufficient to muster the political will to address this issue, as no U.S. president has even submitted the convention to the Senate for ratification. Today's anniversary of that initial adoption by the UN, I think, is a good opportunity for us to reflect a little on why we might be in this situation and what it means for us. In the United States, the arguments against ratifying the Convention on the Rights of the Child, with which I'm most familiar, usually boil down to parental or state sovereignty, or both. At the heart of the resistance is the question of who gets to choose what is in the best interest of the child. Many detractors of the convention insist that parents should get to make that decision no matter what. If there's evidence of abuse and neglect, they may make allowances for the state to intervene. Intervention beyond this, though, is usually resisted, and the idea of a United Nations committee being empowered to determine international standards of care is seen as a threat to both national and parental sovereignty. This is despite the fact that the convention specifically addresses this point in Article 5, where it names and protects, quote, the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents, or, where applicable, the members of the extended family or community, as provided for by local custom, legal guardians, or other persons legally responsible for the child, to provide in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child appropriate direction and guidance in the exercise by the child of the rights recognized in the present convention. The children's version puts it more simply. Governments should let families and communities guide their children so that as they grow up, they learn to use their rights in the best way. The more children grow, the less guidance they will need. These protections are one of the reasons that the ACLU has described popular opposition to the convention as based on incorrect assumptions. They also correctly and importantly point out that underneath those false assumptions, we are avoiding some, quote, hard truths about the exceptionally bad way we treat children in the United States and the related hard work we need to do to bring our laws and practices in line with human rights. Doing that hard work is the priority, whether the United States ever ratifies the convention or not. And while I personally support ratification, there continues to be discussion on what is the most practical way forward. I can understand those who say the objections will likely never be met, and that this means we should focus more on local and statewide movements and legislation for protecting children. Where we agree and where we can work together is on transforming our systems and cultures to actually value and protect the well-being and humanity of our children. This is where we can begin. The Congressional Research Service provided a report on the convention in 2015 that continues to be helpful in understanding the issues, and their summary of objections based on based in parental authority is especially interesting to me. Rather than seeing value in protecting a child's privacy, a provision intended to protect children from government and corporate invasions of privacy, objecting parties wanted to ensure that parents, quote, have the right to search their children's rooms or be notified if a child is arrested or undergoes an abortion. Instead of supporting a child's freedom of expression, objectors feared that the provision, quote, could be interpreted to allow children to speak their minds at all times in opposition even to parental authority. Similarly, they objected to a child's right to freedom of thought, conscience, and a religion because they feared it, quote, might give children the right to object to their parents' religious beliefs or training. Objectors resisted a child's access to information and education because they do not want children to access materials, quote, they find objectionable. A similar reasoning leads to rejection of freedom of association to restrict a child's, quote, right to associate with people that his or her parents do not approve of. Finally, Article 19(1)'s declaration that no child should be subjected to physical or mental violence, injury or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment or exploitation at school or by a parent or legal guardian, was rejected because parents wanted to make sure and maintain their right to use corporal punishment. I can't help but reflect on these ideas through the lens of my own experiences of authoritarian cultures. Whether consciously sought or not, this focus on parental rights to control and coerce their children also connects with the ability of leaders to maintain their own power. It is a self-perpetuating cycle, reinforcing cultural assumptions that, in turn, prop up and reinforce the status quo. While authoritarian tendencies exist across religious and political spectrums, I've only personally experienced it in a conservative context. However, I hope it goes without saying that I oppose authoritarianism in any form, whether on the right or on the left. And I can remember several key moments in my own life on my spiritual journey when I had to do just that, to recognize, resist, and heal from those abuses of authority. For all our sakes, I'm only going to share 2 examples of that today, both from experiences I had in the early 2000s. First comes from a biblical interpretation context. And one of the most notoriously difficult passages in the Christian scriptures comes from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, where we read, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety." Most preachers and exegetes I heard comment on this passage went out of their way to either interpret it in a creative way that reduced the misogyny or dismiss it outright as a corruption of earlier and more egalitarian teachings. So I was surprised when I began encountering preachers who were leaning into and even celebrating an explicitly misogynistic interpretation. I remember clearly hearing a prominent preacher explain that the greatest temptation for women was to usurp the role of men and their headship. Men were divinely appointed to lead and dominate women, and women would need to be content with caring for and dominating children under the umbrella of a man's authority. Usurping a man's place meant doing anything independently, from earning an income to teaching a man. This was literally an argument along the lines of women belong in the kitchen. Moreover, everything needed to be under the authority of a girl's father, a woman's husband, or their male pastor. You couldn't act without a man's permission, and that permission could be revoked at any time. And yet, this control was presented to us all as a benevolent gift. All of this was for her own good. Remember, this entire argument was framed within the context that usurping a man's authority was the greatest temptation and sin for a woman. The best deterrent against such rebellion, this preacher argued, was to have children. Women will be saved through childbearing. Motherhood, he said, would give them a meaningful life while keeping them both busy and tired, reducing their likelihood of falling into sin. On another occasion, I was incredulous as I sat and listened to a robust debate between church members about the age a boy became too old to be taught by a woman, since women should only teach other women and children, lest they assume authority over a man. In conversations and sermons of this sort, I never, ever heard any awareness of the vulnerability of this kind of relationship to domestic violence, and never heard any discussion of the rights and well-being of either women or children. The goal was to maintain the power of male leadership in the home and in the church, taught with the assumption that maintaining patriarchal power would doubtless protect women and children. My second example was something even more shocking to me. I'd gone to listen to a prominent leader of the Missouri Baptist Convention who was going to be a guest preacher at a nearby church event. I was pretty familiar with some version of the talks about male headship and the authority of men. That was common currency in the circles I grew up in. But my childhood church had still generally accepted the goodness of human life and the innocence of babies. I was confronted with my own naivety when I heard this leader describe how babies were selfish from the start and that their crying out, was proof of their inherent total depravity. He lamented that babies don't think at all about the needs of their parents and will cry incessantly until they get what they want. This, he said, was evidence of their sinfulness. It followed in his thinking that parents had a responsibility to punish and control their children, to keep them from indulging their sinful impulses, to convince them of their sinfulness, and to warn them that their sinfulness deserved eternal punishment. I was already a parent by this time, and I couldn't fathom viewing my child as this kind of an enemy, intent on thwarting my well-being and deserving my threats and coercion to bend them to my will. But the pattern was becoming clear. There was no awareness of the vulnerability of this kind of relationship to authoritarian and even abusive parenting. There was no awareness of the rights and well-being of children. The goal was to maintain the power of male leadership in the home and in the church, with the assumption that maintaining men's power would doubtless protect women and children. It was not my experience, and I'm not aware of research that demonstrates that people who hold conservative religious and political views are more likely to abuse or neglect children. However, my experience is that cultures that uphold authoritarian parenting and leadership, whether on the left or the right, create an atmosphere that helps empower and shield abusers. This is in contrast with permissive parenting and leadership styles, which tend towards neglect. Psychological research is helping us better understand how this works. For example, a 2015 study on authoritarian parenting found that almost 50% of children who experienced authoritarian parenting were at risk for anxiety, and 10% were at risk for depression and somatization, with these rates persisting over time. And Dr. Grant Hillary Brenner summarized the results of a 2020 study demonstrating that, quote, all other factors equal, when parents violate psychological boundaries in an attempt to control the inner world of their children, they are setting their children up to be vulnerable to abusive future relationships. And the particular mechanisms the doctor describes for achieving this are familiar to many of us. He wrote, psychological control of others means gaslighting and making others feel ashamed of their own valid feelings and thoughts, using guilt and blame to turn others against themselves and manipulate them, and even sadistically and exploitatively messing with their heads for parents high on dark personality traits. Those mechanisms that Dr. Brenner describes also happen to complement the objections to the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child that we discussed earlier, and it aligns with my own experience of rigid authoritarian religious communities. I personally was trained by my extended religious community and culture to feel ashamed of my basic human inclinations and needs, especially related to gender and sexuality, to experience guilt that blossomed into self-loathing, and to become vulnerable to manipulation, all while I was a child. The lack of protection and resources meant that I spent years doing intensive healing work to grow into my own well-being. We're still repeating tragic versions of this experience in the lives of so many children. And the justification for sacrificing the well-being of our children is often that emphasis on maintaining parental and religious authority, grounded in a fear of losing power to socialize children through psychological control. If I could give a message to those who treated me this way, or who treat other children like this, it is simply this: it didn't work. You hurt me instead. All your insistence on loving and protecting me, of having my best interests in mind, didn't change the reality of that harm. And it's not only psychological control and harm. We can also ask, what are the broader structural results of our failure to protect children? What kind of world have we created for them? In the United States, as Farzad and Ochoa Family Law has pointed out, at least 1 in 7 children suffer child abuse. Approximately 4.3 million children don't have health insurance. Nearly 1.5 million children experience homelessness. About 10,000 children are forced into the commercial sex trade. U.S. Customs and Border Patrol have over 15,500 unaccompanied children detained in overcrowded facilities. Children as young as 12 can labor limitless hours in agricultural work. Approximately 80% of the over 200,000 child brides between 2000 and 2015 were married to an adult. And juvenile detention centers and prisons house around 60,000 minors on any given day. And each one of those points is something that is covered in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. In September, Human Rights Watch released a report card grading each U.S. state on 4 representative issues protecting children and their rights based on that UN Convention: child marriage, corporal punishment, child labor, and juvenile justice. The highest overall grade for any state in the United States was a C, achieved by just 4 states. 26 states received Ds, and the remaining 20 received Fs. Missouri was among them, ranked number 32. As Human Rights Watch observed, the U.S. is the only UN member country that has not ratified the International Treaty on Children's Rights. Most people might think this isn't such a big deal because the U.S. is good for children, but it turns out we aren't, and our state laws don't help. These problems demonstrate the actual dangers that our children are facing across the United States. We have a good idea of what policies would make a difference, and we can and should support them as much and as often as we can. But this particular situation is another area where an important part of our work has to be in transforming our cultures, because our cultural assumptions are standing in the way of our children's well-being. Our collective hesitation to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child can help us understand just how important this cultural transformation is for making real progress as a society. And we can all be engaged in that kind of meaningful work, personally and in our communities, to help make this happen. For many of us adults, we still have internal work to do. Even if you did not get directly wounded, most of us did not escape being socialized into these cultural assumptions. This is especially important for anyone who works for children to break that chain of passing these assumptions along. That includes parents, caregivers, teachers, social workers, and increasingly law enforcement officials. A good foundation for the kind of shift we need is described by Pam Leo as connection parenting, parenting through connection instead of coercion, through love instead of fear. She points out that authoritarian parenting is based on the child's fear of losing the parent's love, while permissive parenting is based on the parent's fear of losing the child's love. They're both reactive, and neither consistently support healthy relationships or child development. In particular, coercion is a quick fix that may get short-term results, but undermines long-term well-being. Shifting to connection is a long-term commitment because a healthy relationship takes time. But it is precisely this commitment that we need to collectively make if we want to open up a way to actually protect children and their capacity to thrive. As Pam Leo put it, let's raise children who won't have to recover from their childhood. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.